Wonderful, welcome. Thank you. And thank you everyone for showing up. I see a lot of international folks in the chat and it warms my heart. So thank you for being here and I hope you're enjoying the CMX Summit so far. So we're here to talk about safety at scale. What makes this a pressing topic right now is the unprecedented level of interest in online community. It's been a growing space for many years, as I'm sure you all know that. But we're going to go over what makes scale the most important topic for you right now in safety. We're going to talk about key distinctions between text and multimedia content at scale. We're going to go over some policies and processes that scale. And finally, we're going to touch on some pitfalls you should probably avoid. So we've kind of entered the age of the platform. Online community, in particular online communities on the major social media sites, this is now mainstream in a way that it wasn't 5-6 years ago. And with COVID, things have just accelerated. It's accelerated a trend that we were already seeing of growth in community and people increasing their community presence online. Now, COVID may have changed the dynamic dramatically. We're going on year 2, it could be year 3 of this global pandemic, which has made work from home and life at home and life over the internet totally different than it used to be and much more widespread. And it's entirely possible that this is going to be a very long-term shift. And with that growth comes increased scrutiny from the government and from the public in general, also in a way that hasn't quite been there before. Flying under the radar is a lot more difficult now than it ever used to be. So we're seeing a lot more urgency on enforcement of safety issues. Landmark things like Christchurch, which is a tragic shooting. Copyright issues are getting renewed interest across the world. There's just a growing overall social awareness of cyberbullying and online hate. And now we're seeing increased focus on this, not necessarily new, but far more widespread phenomenon of information manipulation and misinformation. And there are a lot of calls for active, aggressive content moderation and for communities to take a much more involved role in what is being discussed and shared in their spaces. But on the other side of that, we have some backlash pressure. Skepticism of enforcement. Skepticism of who is doing the enforcement, why they're doing it, what the rules are, and are they fairly applied to everyone. The 2016 and 2020 US elections were a hotbed of this, and all the years in between. Social media data collection, manipulation scandals have sort of emphasized this environment of mistrust of platforms and sort of the authority figures behind online community spaces. And issues of what has stayed up, what's come down, whether it's bots or real people. These are now the subject of national party politics, particularly in the United States. And there are calls for increased transparency, calls for impartiality, and a high sensitivity to restrictions of speech and potentially restricting speech in ways that are biased. And that's on all sides of the political divide. You know, they'll use different language to discuss it, but it's really a multi-party mainstream issue now. So we've got pressure to get it right. We've got pressure to act really fast. There is an unprecedented amount of attention and scrutiny. There's increasing accountability for trial and error and you know, whether or not you're improving and learning from those mistakes. But what all this means really is there's an opportunity here, an opportunity to challenge ourselves and to challenge convention, opportunity to innovate solutions, both on the policy and technical level. And what I'm sure is welcome news for everyone in the community space, an opportunity to get more resources from your companies. They want to get it right too. It's more important than ever that they do. And you guys are the experts that can tell them how to do it and what you need to get it done. So the first thing we should talk about is content, because this content can help you know your risk profile and inform your strategy. I'm sure your communities are incredibly diverse in terms of their membership, in terms of what gets posted by whom, how those discussions evolve. So don't just think about what your community would do now, but also think about what someone coming into your community with bad intentions could do with the tools that your platform makes available to them. But it's not always bad actors. Sometimes you can be misunderstood in Slack. That's a common thing. It's hard to understand tone on text. It's difficult to discern sometimes whether someone's being sarcastic or satirical, or they're just being exactly how it says on the tin. But relatively speaking, text is easy to figure out. The issue is the volume, because chat messages and posts can come extremely quickly. Tweets and other short form content can come extremely quickly. You can have one blog or one image get dozens, hundreds, and for some of you, I'm sure thousands of responses for just that single piece of content. There's also links in text, and you can make decisions about what gets linked, how far away can it be linked. If someone links directly to sexually explicit material, that would be bad in many communities. But what if they link to someone's Instagram, which has normal content, but also some sexual content? Is that okay? What if their Instagram's totally fine, but they have another link in their Instagram bio that takes them somewhere that houses that content? These are all kind of decisions that you'll need to make on the operations side of safety. And I think it's important to notice that text detection and parsing technology is pretty far along for some things. Like spam detection can be really good for that. Social media sentiment analysis, there's been a lot of great strides made there in the past couple of years. But it's not perfect. And it particularly is problematic for non-European languages. The text parsing isn't quite there yet to rely on it fully, but it can be an excellent tool to help your team. And finally, on the response side, you can edit, hide, delete. These are tools that you have in text, particularly on the edit side, that are quite handy. And they can be relatively low risk or low visibility. For instance, hiding a comment or hiding a response in a very long forum thread is not going to be nearly as visible as taking down someone's entire video. Speaking of multimedia, generally speaking, it's a lower volume, but high nuance, and most importantly, endless possibilities. It not only includes text, but you also think titles, captions, images, sounds, whether it has songs, verbal commentary over top of the video and visual footage. Whether that footage is user-generated or taken from somewhere else, and whether it's been taken just as it is, or if it's been remixed or edited in some kind of way. This resharing can be very low effort, but can also, introduce issues of copyright and ownership. So that's definitely an issue that you'll need to keep in mind. And also, I would say that probably the most challenging thing about video is that these multiple elements can combine to change the overall meaning and impact, either delivering on expectations or subverting those expectations. Sometimes the answer is not as straightforward as it might appear just by looking at it or just by listening to it. And that meaning can change over time, particularly if the content is quite long. Thankfully, this video and interactive content is generally increased effort, so there won't be as much of it. However, the increased effort, the high visibility, and the possibility of monetizing a lot of this content, particularly video content, it can drive a more visceral attachment to that content, identification of that content, and engagement with that content from both the creator and their viewers and consumers. So where do we start? You want to start with your community values and identity. That's where safety scales. There's a lot of operational things that you can do to help safety scaling, but at the end of the day, you need to know what your end goal is, and that end goal should be driven by your community values. Some policies are universal, like spam is bad. I think we can all agree spam is bad. And of course, there are legal compliance issues to consider as well. Sometimes several of them if your communities are international. But otherwise, the level of nuance that you're willing to consistently evaluate for in practice in the day-to-day experience of your users, that is your scaled policy. So when you're thinking about, where to go beyond social or legal expectations, start from your community values and work backwards from there. Keep in mind the needs of the everyday experience inside your community. That means thinking about the limitations of your platform products or the things that they suggest that your users should do. Think about what your users want to do and find the right fit for both your people and the platform that you're using to engage with them and that they engage with each other in. Transparency is hard, and communicating safety issues is also really hard, but it's vital. Bad actors are going to criticize you no matter what. You got to keep in mind that sometimes they'll use information that you release against you and your users. So you need to be careful about what you say and how you say it. But at the end of the day, you should still do it. Set clear rules, clear expectations, and educate your users before and after interacting with your trust and safety response, whether that's content moderation or filtering or your one-on-one conversations with that problematic user that you really like, but sometimes puts their foot in their mouth. And ideally, you're setting up those expectations and rules before they're interacting with each other. So new user areas can be good for this on some of the older forum communities, but that can't always scale either. Start thinking about how you're approaching user education in a more comprehensive way. When possible, empower users to regulate their own experience and their own spaces. Just like in the physical world, having rules, having security guards, it's no substitute for self-defense, right? If users are having a negative experience in that moment, they are best positioned to having a negative experience and to react to it. Give them the tools and the empowerment that they need to handle that situation in a way that works best for them. On a very basic level, this can be tools like blocking, but that is far from the endpoint of that conversation. Identify and quarantine issues fast and early. The quicker you can prevent bad content from being seen, the better. Prevent virality when possible. This can look like having an effective reporting flow and a report investigation flow. There could be additional tools that your platform makes available to you for this kind of thing. But generally speaking, you want to contain any piece of bad content, even if you aren't sure what to do with it yet. Just kind of put it for a sec before things get out of hand, and then you can respond. But also be aware that sometimes, and in fact, you're probably asking for it, anytime you have any kind of system like this, bad actors are going to attempt to game the system to take down content or to harass people in ways that you don't want. So make sure that you're thinking of safeguards to prevent well-intentioned normal users from being affected by these systems, because there are bad actors that are targeting them. It's going to happen, so have a plan in place based on what your platform can do and how many resources you have to bring to bear. But try to think of some remediation for that, because it's almost guaranteed. Use objective criteria whenever possible. This is also something really, really, really hard because a lot of safety issues call into things like intent and sometimes power dynamics. Who is saying what to who? That can change whether or not what they're saying is okay. But when possible, as someone who is managing trust and safety in an online community, try to be objective. Be exact where you need to be. Be flexible where you can be. If you're going to make exceptions to some kind of rule that you've laid out, those exceptions should be logically consistent with what you've done before and be publicly defensible. Not that I'm recommending that you do this, but a helpful tool to think about is if you did have to go in front of your community and defend some kind of decision that you've made that grants someone or something an exception to your rules, how comfortable would you be if your community knew why that exception was being made? And if you don't feel like you'd be very comfortable talking about it, it's useful to take a step back and think about why, and then just double check your decision making and your decision process to see if that's the right approach. And the Trinity: QA, escalations, and appeals. Particularly as your community is scaling up, you need to check your enforcements for consistency. It's great if you have a huge team of volunteer moderators, but you need to keep an eye on what they're doing, and not just when complaints happen. Set up a system where you're checking their activity on a regular basis. That helps you spot errors, spot maybe areas where your moderation team is maybe confused on rules, or maybe you've made a recent change and it hasn't gotten filtered out to everyone. It can help you spot those issues and go in and correct them. Make sure there are clear paths to other teams and high-level decision makers if an issue comes up, and what criteria should be in place to use those channels. And if we get it wrong, and if it gets missed, give users that have been actioned on some way to raise an issue. Sometimes remorse is a powerful thing, and you may want to give people a way back in if they recognize that their behavior has been bad and they're committed to fixing it. And finally, anticipate legal notices, law enforcement, and regulations. When I was managing a much smaller online community, we didn't really have a strong DMCA process. It was kind of loose and informal. I really encourage you to formalize that kind of thing as much as possible. Think about government takedown requests. Think about requests from law enforcement. Strongly consider proactively reporting illegal content to places like NCMEC and other governmental and non-governmental organizations that are essential to keeping people safe in the real world. And if you have a legal department, build that bridge internally with them. It's 100% worth it to invest in that relationship, and it can lead to some pleasantly surprising support, both from them and potentially other teams. Invest in relationships with them. Build understanding with them about your community's needs, both in terms of risk and opportunity for expression and other things, and how you're thinking about balancing them. And also take the time to listen to what their needs are as well. Some pitfalls to avoid. We're running out of time here, so I'll just go through these pretty quick here. I want to make sure we have time for Q&A. You're never going to get the 100% right policy that covers everything perfectly. It doesn't exist. You should strive for it, but recognize that you're not going to get there. And the difference between getting 99% of what you want and 95% of what you want and 90% of what you want can be the difference between your policy being scalable and not scalable. Generally speaking, the more moving parts, the more things that can go wrong. Keep it simple where you can. Accuracy is coming at the expense of speed, and adding complexity is often easier than taking it away. So I recommend starting simple, starting small, working your way from there as you can, and see what your team and your community can handle and what you need to put in there. Moving too slowly on toxic behavior in subcommunities has the unfortunate effect of letting them take root. Community standards of behavior are a powerful thing, but your standard is not what it says in your community guidelines necessarily. It's what your users are going to observe in terms of action and reaction, both from your community and from you. So make sure that your community standards are what you want them to be, and make sure that you actually back them up, and that that's the day-to-day experience of your users as much as possible. Keep in mind that if you're not backing up your community guidelines, that the behavior that you're allowing is going to become a standard of behavior, and that those attitudes can grow, spread, and entrench, and it can be very difficult to remove them after the fact. It's worth doing, but it's also worth trying to prevent it if you can. And finally, don't give trolls infinite lives. Too many second chances can undermine your perception of reliability. Figure out when enough is enough and put an objective standard in place for what to do when that happens. Even if it's someone the community really likes, if they're continually causing problems, it might be time to let them go. And with that, I'm going to open it up for questions.
Thank you very much, Greg. That was fantastic and very well received. So I can see the chat is actually is buzzing with comments about these very, very important issues. So we have a time for a couple of questions. So I kindly asked the listeners to upload the questions. So we can't answer them all, unfortunately. We don't have that much time, but there's some fantastic questions. So the first one right away is from Diane Yuan. If there's skepticism of enforcement in the community and rules have been applied inconsistently to offenders, what's the best approach for the company to gain back social trust? Where should the focus be?
I would say the focus, that's a hard question. It's definitely something near and dear to my heart, but I think the focus should be getting your house in order first. If your perception is inconsistency, it might be because you've been inconsistent in the past. Figure out why. Fix that process. Getting the user perception of trust is something that you're going to have to work on over time. It's consistency over time. That's really what building trust is. You've got to get the consistency part first and stick to it for long enough that it starts to change that narrative. You may also, need some help. Kind of marketing is a bad word, but like communicating what you're doing differently and reinforcing that message publicly. And that could be a great opportunity if you're in a very large company to leverage like your social team or your communications team. If it's just you doing all those things, you can think about how to incorporate that kind of communication into your strategy. You don't want to be too defensive or too aggressive with it. Let the users see what you're doing and kind of take that credit from there. But at the same time, you can raise awareness when it's appropriate that you've made a rules change or that you recognize this has been handled poorly in the past, but you're going to be doing it differently. You might not necessarily want to say exactly what the issue was or what's changed, depending on how sensitive that is. But letting them know that you're working on it can go a long way. But most importantly, you've got to deliver. You've got to start being consistent.
Fantastic. So we've got time to squeeze in one more question. So I'm just looking at the most popular one, and that's from Lisa. Lisa Del Sol is asking, what's your best suggestion to get the company's attention if they don't feel like trust and safety are important at the moment? We see it important now as we grow, definitely, but because we are still small scale, we are still manual and reactive instead of proactive.
This is always a challenging question for smaller communities or smaller community teams. Unfortunately, a lot of C-level folks do not value community as it should be, and particularly the trust and safety side of it. I feel like that's going to be changing pretty fast, but it might not change as fast in your own company. Be the advocate for that change. Look at what's going on in the wider industry. Raise that, as major safety events happen in the news or articles come out, those can be important ways that you can validate your position. Groups like CMX and other places in the online community professional space will have resources on how to communicate to decision makers. I can't recommend them highly enough. That could be its own session. In fact, it probably is. I don't know that I can go into it here, but leverage those resources. It's a very valuable skill. It will pay incredible dividends over time. So invest in your ability to communicate to senior decision makers. And part of that communication is building a relationship. If I had to say any one thing that could help you generate movement on that, it's building a relationship with those decision makers beyond any single safety issue that you're talking about. Invest in getting to know them and them getting to know you, having that open line of dialogue formally and informally. Back channeling can be very, very helpful. Bringing these issues up in casual conversation, asking them what they think, probing them for values, and then coming up with solutions that speak to what they care about, that can be helpful in starting to move the needle there.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Great suggestions. Those are fantastic and so relatable and so important for anyone who's responsible for managing or dealing with communities. So, Greg, your suggestions and your input, the things that we heard from you, they were golden. Thank you very much. It's great to have you here. Everyone, thank you for the engagement. It's been fantastic. Definitely looking forward to our next conversation here, and we hope to have you as a listener as well, Greg.
Absolutely. Wouldn't miss it.
Yep. All the best. See you in the next one.
Bye, everyone.